Okay. Okay, here we go. I just popped out to this little garden outside my mom's kitchen. Nobody ever really comes back here that much. But anyway, I want to slow down here a little bit and take my time today because I want to talk to you about intentionality. Um, we have an ordinary. Well, let me locate us a little better as I warm up a little here. Um, we're in our philosophy of psychology class here. Really, I teach it in something that philosophers is sort of inside baseball would consider the class that I teach to be more a philosophy of mind class. Sort of like when you're out in the countryside in Ireland and you call someplace a village and the people say, well, it's more of a town really, or you say you're in a town and the people say, well, it's really more of a village. You know, and sometimes people want to tell you, well, it's philosophy of mind or it's philosophy of psychology. And there is a real distinction, although philosophy of psychology, which is the title of the course that I teach, um, is includes, the history of philosophy and rationalism and empiricism and all that stuff, as well as some technical matters that are considered philosophy of psychology today. Philosophy of mind dealing with sort of the metaphysics of the mind-body relationship. And as I say, that's really sort of where I'm going to concentrate today. So we're going to learn about a philosopher's use of this word intentionality. I mean, you have an ordinary sense of intention and intention, so you can make sense of intentionality in terms of having intentions, having aims and goals, the way Kant talked about rational beings all having aims and goals, and so being ends in themselves, because each one had their own set of ends, because they were all rational and they all had these intentions. Oh, okay. So philosophers use intentionality in a closely related, but somewhat different sense. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. My goal here is really mostly to explain, sorry about that, really mostly to explain what intentionality is. I find it's one of those philosophical phrases where a lot of people don't have a firm enough grasp on what it really means. It's inside, it's jargon. So hopefully it'll be our only jargon word today, intentionality in the philosophical sense. And then the subtitle there, I say the metaphysics of meaning. The other thing is, there's only a problem if there's a problem. Things don't have to be a problem. Intentionality is a problem from a certain metaphysical point of view. So finding out about intentionality and why intentionality is a problem also involves us in, a basic introduction to also what metaphysics is. Intentionality, the metaphysics of meaning. So there's that property that things have of meaning. So it seems as if the book that we're reading, the words have meaning. It seems as if the stop sign means something, the recipe means something, and so on. Symbolic meaning. I mean, other things also mean things to us in the sense that they give us information that we can use to make inferences. So think about the expression on a person's face. It's certainly, I think, would be pretty normal usage to say that there are meanings on a person's face, but they're not exactly like linguistic objects or painted pictures, right? They're more like the rings in tree stumps or something like that, I think. But it's not that important of a point. But I'm talking about sort of symbolic meaning. And so, all right. So let's get on with it. And as I say, along the way to finding out what intentionality is, if we can figure out, if I can get across why it's a problem, that'll also get across a number of points about just metaphysics in general. I think a lot of people are sort of surprised to find that there still is such a thing as metaphysics. The manager of the bookstore here on campus certainly was surprised when he decided not to order the metaphysics books because he just thought it was some kooky thing. So that when I showed up for the fall seminar, there weren't any metaphysics textbooks in the store, but I should have known that. But I digress. Let's stick to loftier topics and figure out what intentionality means. As I say, we have representations all over the place. A lot of what we're talking about here is around the concept of representation. And what are we doing as philosophers? We're thinking about concepts. We're thinking about the concept of representation. We're thinking about the concept of meaning. And we're thinking about the concept of mind. And then we have this word intentionality. And what we're working on here is unpacking that and figuring out what people mean when they say intentionality in this conversation. So meaning, right? It's the story about Flopsy Bunny. And I can draw a picture of Flopsy Bunny. And so my picture is a picture of Flopsy Bunny. But language, now spoken languages, I mean, you can get fancy about this, but let's talk about language in the sense of idioms and pictures, in the sense of human artifacts, representational artifacts. These are conventions. Ask yourself if you understand what I mean by this. Again, it's the second bullet point on the slide there. The only things that are really about other things, I mean, you say the stop sign is about something, but the only thing that's really about something is my sort of response to the stop sign, or that is to see my mind seems as if it's about things like stopping, or for example, you're thinking about a stop sign right now. So there isn't any stop sign here in the room or the room where you are. So, okay. So it seems as if there are mental states. Now, again, you have to think concept by concept of the material of the mind, because psychology is a language where we're trying to talk about things that aren't ordinary material objects like our language was evolved to talk about. So a lot of it's figurative. So paying close attention to the concepts when we're talking about the mind is a good bit of work. So, all right. So what are these mental states, these intentional states? So what are we agreeing on? We're agreeing that there's a set of mental states that are called the intentional states. What are those? For example, these include beliefs, desires, hopes, fears, suspicions, intentions, expectations, and so on. What do these all have in common? They all have content. You have, as I say in the third bullet point there, I believe that Neptune is green. The content of my belief is the greenness of Neptune. I have a desire to see Neptune tonight. The content, the object of my desire is Neptune. I hope it's not too cloudy, and so on, right? And so, and I'm not outside right now, and I'm not looking at the sky, and Neptune isn't up yet, and but it looks as if I have these intentional states which have a property. You can call it also the property of aboutness if you want, but we'll use what most people use, which is meaning. Also notion of reference, referring to something else or being about something else, meaning something. And again, with the proviso that we're not talking about the sense in which everything means something in the sense that you can sort of infer things from other things, but we're talking about, again, intentional, if you will, symbolic content. Right? So remember that sense. I mean, it does look like the recipe means something and the stop sign means something, but really it's that it looks like you have mental states, beliefs, desires, etc., which have meaning. And that's really where that property, the property of being about something, resides. It resides, it would appear, in your beliefs about Neptune, right? That's the thing. Your belief about Neptune is the thing. It has this property that we're interested in, the property of being about something else, about Neptune. So now the last bullet point, then we can then define intentionality as the term in this philosophical conversation as a piece of jargon where we started. It's the term philosophers use to refer to that property of meaning, specifically when we realize that it is really a property of mind somehow. It's not a property of symbols printed on a page or paint strokes on a canvas or something like that. Rather, it is, in the case so far, human minds, just so it makes it a little easier to get our mind around it, not necessarily human minds. All right, so I'm going to go over then. 4, actually, and this is sort of the meat of it, because really the goal here is to understand what the problem of intentionality is as part of sort of the current state of affairs of the mind-body problem, if you will, the metaphysics of the mind-body problem. And this going through these 4 problems will help us also just see what metaphysics is. If you're kind of sort of, as most people are, maybe it's reasonable to be sketchy like the bookstore manager was about what metaphysics is. Little rhetoric in the first point, right? Materialism, naturalism, physicalism, all isms, all kind of little mini theories, right? That everything's made out of matter, that everything's natural, that everything's physical, I guess, respectively. So there are some differences. And I guess if you're into this kind of thing, you could nitpick differences between these 3. And you might get a good paper out of that. And as I say to my students, and I'll be the first to publish it. That's a little teacher joke there. Well, matter, it's reasonable to point out that, what physics says that matter is something really strange these days. So it's not clear exactly what you buy from that. Naturalism sounds the most hippie, so people will like naturalism the most. Materialism sounds the most Nazi, so that's the one that will be the least popular. But you see, that's rhetoric. The point is, there's kind of roughly, again, second bullet point, there's kind of a monistic notion that everything is made out of one kind of stuff and that we can explain everything in sort of one kind of way. So that's basically the idea. And notice with metaphysics, right, that doesn't have to be a problem. And also, I would want to say right now, in fact, I'll even step out of it to show how important, and that I really do think that it is, just to avoid misunderstanding. There are, psychology, the logos of the psyche, the study of the psyche. There are a lot of different meanings of the word psychology. So think of, for example, an analogy you could make between cognitive science and psychoanalysis, say, is that in psychoanalysis, somebody might be interested in what it is that you're drawing on your Etch-a-Sketch with your little 2 knobs, what the picture is, what it is that you're saying with your Etch-a-Sketch when you draw pictures. And the cognitive scientist or psychologist might be someone who wants to, look at those little knobs and maybe, scrape all that silver stuff off so they can see that mechanism underneath. And those are 2 just different interests. They don't have to be in some sort of conflict with each other. You don't have to be hostile to each other or anything like that. We're just, if you're opposed to the, naturalizing things, naturalizing psychology, naturalizing psychology, I can explain actually what that means now. But again, wanting to emphasize that, nothing has to be a problem. Some of these issues are ideological. And so, you can make your own sense of them. Our goal here is to understand what the conversation is about, what the conversation is saying. So, okay. So with that, then let's get back to this. So that's the first metaphysical problem. The idea that causal explanations, physical causal explanations, are closed. What does that mean? They only refer to physical states and properties and processes. Only physical causes. So if I go to the car mechanic, and the car mechanic might tell me that I need a new air hose, and I need to fix the fuel pumps. I'm making it up. I don't know. And but I would be surprised. I mean, maybe if I lived in Beverly Hills, maybe Jennifer Aniston has a car mechanic where, if you want, they'll put crystals around the car and make invocations to the fuel pump goddess. Okay, and that would be an example of a car mechanic that did not have a closed physical description and explanation of what they were doing. That is, along the line, while they were telling you about your air hose and stuff, they also started talking about non-physical things that had unexplainable interactions, causal interactions, since they weren't physical causal interactions with physical things. So, so I mean, you wouldn't say in the case of, I guess, car mechanics, well, you're really kind of closed-minded and reductive, that you want to only have physical explanations, Am I right? But look, what's wrong with nature? What's wrong with being part of nature? I mean, you are a physical organism. I mean, it ought to be, right? That you can sort of get down to talking about you in natural terms. Well, I don't know. Well, that's the issue. Um, so third bullet point then, I do think it is kind of inspiring. I mean, we live in a very naturalistic culture where everything from down to atoms and microorganisms and all the way up to, galaxies and nebula are all things that we just sort of have internalized the idea that these are physical kinds of things. We can talk about in physical sorts of ways. And I think it's really, as I say, sort of inspiring in the year 2021 that when we talk about psychology, actually, that's not the case. And if you want to know why you can't reduce psychology to some kind of natural science, you're in the right place. I mean, that's what we talk about here. Um, so so here's the a really basic problem that the fourth bullet point then finally. Um, so I'm sitting here and my hand here, my hand doesn't, it's there. Oh, whoa, my hand's there. But my hand doesn't mean anything, right? And my hand doesn't mean anything, and my foot doesn't mean anything, and the sock doesn't mean anything. Again, they don't mean anything in that, they don't have that property of being about something. They might be fodder for inference, but they don't have that property of aboutness, of referring to anything. Um, and neither does my brain, right? I mean, my brain, just like my hand, I mean, you can look at it all you want. All you're going to see is physical stuff, biological stuff. That's it, doing its biological thing. And it definitely doesn't mean anything, and I don't mean anything, and the table doesn't mean anything. Physical objects don't have the property of being about anything. They don't have the property of meaning anything. Meaning, that is, does not look to be a physical property. And voila, there's your metaphysical problem, right? I mean, remember, we wanted to only be dealing and trucking and trading and mongering in physical properties, right? Because we're proper physicalist people, I guess. And looks like meaning doesn't fit in. It doesn't seem like meaning's a physical property. Okay, so there's your first and really very much most basic issue with intentionality. It looks as if your belief is about something else, but it looks like the property of being about something else isn't a property that any kind of physical thing has, including you. So that's a problem if you want it to be, if you don't have a real job. Okay, here we go. An extension of that, mental causation. Again, 500 years ago, mental causation was sort of, how does Casper the Friendly Ghost knock down the row of dominoes? Since Casper the Friendly Ghost isn't solid, so if he doesn't have these physical properties, how can he interact with non-physical? In other words, 500 years ago, to put it in unsnarky language, there was the idea that there was a non-physical soul, and the non-physical soul had a causal interaction with the physical body. And they were somehow affecting each other, even though the only way, it was already clear that the only way we could talk about physical things ordinarily was in terms of physical causation. So that's the old problem of mental causation. The problem is, how does the mind have a causal power when the mind is a non-physical thing? But so then you're tempted to say, well, now's the year 2021, so we don't have really any kind of problem with mental causation anymore. We just know that everything's physical. But unfortunately, consider this. Say that somebody we were in class and somebody got up and left. And I said, why did he leave just now? And you said, because he was thirsty, right? And that is a little bit of intentional explanation. When I talk about psychology here, I'm just talking about, why did he leave? Because he was thirsty. Do you like chocolate? Yeah, I do. That's what I mean by psychology. I don't mean anything technical by it. So how does that unpack, though? Why do you leave? He's thirsty. It unpacks this way, that you're explaining his behavior by saying that he had a desire for a drink, and he had a belief that the water fountain was down the hall, and all other things being equal, then that desire and that belief will tend to cause the formation of an intention, another intentional state, to go down to the end of the hall and get the drink. And that's how that unpacks. in terms of his sort of intentional economy, if you will. He's got these beliefs and desires, and that's where they are right now. But imagine if I said, why did he leave? And, you know, you're Mr. Smart Aleck, psychology major, and you say, well, you know, there was an electrical event in his neocortex, and that sent a signal down the spine, and it sent it out to the muscle, and it jolted the muscle, which caused it to contract, and so it swiveled on the bone, and so his leg moved, and so on. And that was the explanation that you gave me. And that would just be weird. And so would any explanation, like in his hypothalamus, there were negatively charged potassium ions, and then they all started to sort of change their charge. Same deal. That I don't want to know anything like that. I mean, so you'd have to have a psychophysical translations. And, you know, there's some interesting technology right now for paralyzed people and stuff like that. And it's really good technology. But it's sort of, you have to sort of customize it so far to the individual. That is, you can map on brainwave patterns in individuals, and you can start to build up a little lexicon of meaning, which is great. And I say that, notice as I go on here, that's technology that sort of cuts against some of the things that, some of the directions I sort of go on. For example, the last bullet point on this slide, it looks as if, and these are the first one, the A out of the A and B there on the third point is a lot, but look at I'll just toss it out there. I believe the fish are in the barrel. Flipper, who's in the pool, he believes that the fish are in the barrel. The alien from outer space who's come down from his ship, he believes that the fish are in the barrel. Oh, and the intelligent android, you know, he also believes the fish are in the barrel. And so we all have that intentional state, a belief with content, but it looks as if we don't have the same kind of bodies, and, you know, we don't have the same kind of insides. So then when you say I'm going to have a psychophysical laws that are going to explain the translations from physical states to semantic states to meaning, that's one reason for thinking that's probably not going to be so easy to do. And then another different reason is number B there, being that, as I said, when we were asking about, when I asked why he left the room, you have an intentional economy. I mean, you have a very large network of beliefs and desires and hopes and fears and so on that are unique to you and your experience and your being. And yours aren't the same as anyone else's. And what the meaning of any little chunk of that, this is called holism about meaning, for what it's worth, to some extent is going to depend on sort of its weighted connections with all of these other intentional states that you have. So another reason why the CIA isn't going to be able to sort of read your, you know, your thoughts off of your brain states anytime soon. I don't think, but I could be wrong. So now here's a funky problem that hasn't received all that much attention. This is a problem that I'm working on for publication, you know, in my popular kind of way. Propositions and the difference between metaphysical problems. So wait a minute, let's go back here. Mental causation. Causation is metaphysical, right? That is, if there's a problem about causation, it's metaphysical because we talk about physical causation in physical science. So, and there is whole literature about causation. It's a literature that's a sub-literature of the larger topic of metaphysics, because of course physics is assuming physical causation. So metaphysical problem then number 3. In this case, it looks like there's a kind of entity, species of entity called propositions, to which the theory commits us. In this case, it's cognitivism, although I think this is true of, I think this is a problem for any representational theory of mind. Notice in passing that nowadays representational theories of mind are tend to be formal. That is, they think that mental representations have a formal structure like sentences, they have a grammatical structure, and that's been a really important assumption underlying research in cognitive science for a long time, since the 1970s. Okay, So the propositional attitude model of intentional states, that sounds like a lot. Well, it's just this, second bullet point, that you have a proposition, that Neptune is green, say, and then you have all these attitudes. You can be in the attitude of believing the proposition, the attitude that it's true, the attitude of desiring that the proposition is true, doubting that the proposition is true, and so on. That is, these are attitudes towards proposition. So sometimes we call intentional states that clauses, the belief that Neptune is green, the hope that we'll see Neptune tonight, the doubt that Neptune will turn out to be orange, and so on, right? And so notice then that the content is propositional. And of course, this is Chomsky, right? The idea is that the generative grammar allows the linguistic being to generate all of these propositions that are hung on that grammatical structure. Now, if I go to the cognitive science convention and I'm this philosopher and I start to say I'm going to talk about metaphysics, all these like linguists and computer scientists and cognitive psychologists and people, neurophysiologists, look at him. I mean, maybe I'll find him later on and see what he's smoking, but right now, I'm not that interested. But the irony here is that it actually turns out that it's cognitivists who have representational theories of mind, including anyone who has, for example, an information processing model of nervous system function, anyone at all, is actually committed, strictly speaking, to non-physical properties and the non-physical entities that have the non-physical properties. Properties don't just float around. If you think there's a property, there's got to be something that's got the property. So if you think there's a non-physical property, then you think there's got to be some non-physical thing that has it. And so this weird property of meaning then gets assigned to these weird entities, which are propositions. Look at point number 3. That is, I say there, Neptune is green, Neptune is green. Okay, how many sentences are there? You can, well, there are 2 sentences, but there is one proposition. There is one proposition which is instantiated twice in 2 different physical tokens. That is to say, those black areas that define the letters on the white screen. So, see, the thing is, it looks as if I would like to be, really the sort of naturalist and get it straightened out and not have any non-physical entities and properties and processes in the description. And it looks to me as if it's these cognitive psychologists and a lot of neurophysiologists even, although I think neurophysiologists are the ones who are most sober about all of this, including philosophers, by the way, who actually are committed to, so far, they have not managed to scrub out reference to non-physical properties and therefore, by extension, non-physical entities from their theories. And this, I think, is a problem for representational theories in general. They are not natural because representations have meaning. That's how they work. Notice the representation looks like it works somehow from one point to another, intersubjectively too. Another thing that representational theories of mind struggle with. Okay, so then there's the metaphysical problem number 3, that it looks as if the theory commits us to something called propositions, which sentences are merely tokens of, and which exist, by the way, then presumably without any physical tokens. Think about all the thoughts that have never been thought, or all the sentences that have never been written down before, right? It looks like I can refer to these. All right, so metaphysical then, because it looks as if there's some sort of category of things that are non-physical things that the theory is committed to the existence of. And lastly, but not leastly, the meteorological fallacy, which I think is really important. Also important, for example, to neurophysiology and other interdisciplinary areas of cognitive studies. Um, my job sort of is to sniff out lingering Cartesianism, mind-body dualism. The idea is to look at these concepts and make sure, or whatever you want to do with it. So now think you had the soul, and the soul was like the little alien inside in Men in Black, right? In Men in Black, and you open the guy's head up and there's a little alien in there looking out and pulling on the controls. And the Cartesian soul is like that, right? You're sort of looking out of your eyes, and you're up in your head, and you're kind of moving your body around, but you're not really your body. You're really this immaterial thing. Somehow maybe you're connected to your body, like with a radio receiver or whatever. So now notice though, it's tempting to just swap in the brain, but to keep that whole conceptual structure. And so now the brain is the little person in the head. Now the brain is doing all the work. Now you're thinking because the brain is thinking. Now you're remembering because the brain is remembering. Which also, by the way, looks a lot more explanatory than it really is. People say, well, how could you explain thinking without mental representations? And I think the right answer to that question is that mental representation models don't do anything to explain thinking. I mean, I remember my mother by remembering what she looks like. I'm pulling up a little picture out of a file cabinet. That doesn't explain anything at all. I know what it's like. So the meteorological fallacy is this fallacy of mistaking the sum of the parts for the whole. And again, any representational theory, I think, is committed to that fallacy. So listen to this last bullet point. I think this is true. I don't say this for effect. I think, though, that it's important because a lot of people really don't get this. And also, by the way, think about what we know about what brains really do. Brains, the physical things, brains, the organs. Think about, what we need to, we need, if we want to understand what they really do, what their function really is, how they really work. And notice here how misconception can actually sort of lead us off and get us down the wrong kind of conceptual path in terms of the kind of work maybe that we should be doing. So again, fourth bullet point on the slide. I'll just read it out. It's my manifesto, but I don't make this up. Brains do not think, they don't imagine, recognize patterns, brains don't solve problems, brains don't produce speech or comprehend speech, Wernicke's area, Brokaw's area. Brains don't dream. And brains don't believe and desire. Brains don't have beliefs and desires and hopes and fears and intentions and so on. There are beings who, that we can, coherently predicate as having beliefs and desires and hopes and fears and so on. Those beings are persons, embodied persons in environments. Those people, and we do talk about those people that way, actually. It's only when we're, philosophers and other people are bamboozling us that we think that when we talk about beliefs and desires, we're talking about some strange occult part of a person's brain or mind or something. No, we mean whole persons. We mean, she really likes chocolate. She's really hoping that we go to the mall this afternoon. No, talking about her, a whole person. So, and as I say, when you notice that if you just still have this sort of lingering Cartesianism about the brain, so the brain is a little person like in Men in Black, then among other things, I think that's going to throw you off in terms of putting together your experimental paradigm and doing neurophysiology. Well, eliminativism, that's a fancy word, and it's a word that gets used for a number of different senses too. So it's a metaphysical word, eliminative, that is, eliminate something from your sort of catalog of things that exist. So talk about history of science. you see in the history of science smooth intertheoretic reduction. That is, Zeus's thunderbolts are later on identified as these electrical discharges caused by friction buildups of water molecules in clouds, I believe it is. So you have that, and now we know what Zeus's thunderbolts really are. That is, they really are these electrical discharges from the clouds. But that's not always happened. Moving to the second bullet point, that's not always what happens in the history of science. There was a dome of the heavens when we thought that we were at the middle of the universe and we were looking out from the center of the universe. And then there were celestial spheres. There are all kinds of versions of the dome of the heavens. But at some point, people got to thinking that they were standing on a sphere out in empty space, decentered from the center of the universe. And at that point, there wasn't any dome of the heavens anymore. It didn't survive intertheoretic reduction. It was eliminated. So we see examples. So the point is this, that when we look at the actual history of science, what we see is examples of intertheoretic reduction, but we also see from time to time examples of elimination. So, and remember how long people have been talking about intentional states and beliefs and desires and so on since the beginning of language itself. It's sort of interesting what that tells us. It tells me that there's something that's ineliminable there. I tend to think that a lot of the language of goal-directed rational beings between each other is going to be in terms of these intentional terms, and that they're ineliminable. I think, though, that mental representation as a functional term and understanding how the brain works needs to be eliminated. It looks to me like it's clearly untrue. Just as a footnote, it doesn't matter if you know what this means or not, but there are philosophers called the Churchlands. My view, it turns out, I'm just pointing out that's the opposite of theirs. That is, they think that intentionality might be eliminated, but not mental representation. I think that mental representation might be eliminated, but not intentional language. So in any event, we can be eliminativist about mental representation, and that's what I want to be. I don't think, so why? For metaphysical reasons in my case, because it looks like mental representations, including any kind of information moving around, has non-physical properties, so it's not a fully naturalized model. And so, for what it's worth, I mean, that's what I'm doing. I'm, so it used to be philosophers got up in the morning, had breakfast, and wrote proofs for the existence of God. It could be worse. But notice something here. I've been kind of glib, haven't I? We're going to eliminate mental representations. I don't think there are any such things as mental representations. When I remember my mother's face, that's not a mental representation. Is that what I'm saying? Yes, it is. And so but then I can't just say that. Last bullet point on the slide. There has to be some alternative. I think that roughly here, that is the empiricists who are sort of against mental content. Remember the tabula rasa of John Locke. And it's rationalists. Remember the clear and distinct ideas of Descartes, who are really in favor of mental representational theories of mind. I do point out there that in the last bullet point, the point I made before, that you say, well, how can I explain anything without representation? And I think the right answer to that is to put pressure on the idea that you're explaining anything by appealing to representation at all. However, it gets worse for Batman and Robin, because it looks like if I was going to eliminate representation and the property of meaning from philosophy of mind, we're going to have to do it for our philosophy of language as well. There's metaphysics of language, right? And it looks like linguistic objects, words and phrases and paragraphs and novels, they look like they have some of these properties, property of meaning, for example, as well. In fact, it looks like our whole model of the way that language works is pretty thoroughly saturated with this concept of meaning. So if anybody thinks they're going to be able to scrub the concept of meaning out of philosophy of mind, well, sure, good luck. They're going to have to scrub it out of the philosophy of language as well. Okay, fine, hold my beer. Second bullet point. We have to provide an account of the way that language functions that doesn't refer to meaning at all. That's the one we need to get rid of. Okay, and it looks as if using the concept of meaning right now, we can talk about how language functions. It functions by virtue of its property of meaning, just as this other thing makes me sleepy by virtue of its normative properties, right? So we want to figure out how the mind functions without appealing to mental representation. Again, I think that's kind of important. The last bullet point is about the sort of traditional, some people pejoratively call it sort of magical way of thinking about meaning, that words are kind of vessels, and you open them up like the suitcase in the Quentin Tarantino movie, and the shining comes out and the meaning comes out, because the meaning is kind of in there. Like the meaning's in the book. If you open the book, you can get the meanings out because they're kind of sitting in there, stored. Notice two surfaces. We call the surface of this inner and outer picture of mind. You have your expression and your body language and everything else about you, but then inside of you, there's this unobservable, right, sort of area where this has got all this content that no one else can see. And then it's the same inner outer model of language, that language also has this surface, that the words on the page are the surface, but inside of them, there's this kind of underneath them somehow, they contain these meanings. And we're now going to talk about, I think, just very briefly, because my main focus here is to get you to see what the problem of intentionality is, but I'm going to show you now, just to end things, what I take to be the best empiricist response to the problem. Okay. So let me read out that last one. On the traditional view, words and phrases are a sort of receptacle containing set meanings, right? They sit there to be discovered, just as behavior is seen as an indication of some inner mental content. The empiricist response is to stay on the surface, as with behavioral psychology. And so another sort of thing about me that maybe people don't like is that I think that behaviorist approaches to psychology are kind of actually underappreciated in terms of, for example, achieving a semantics of psychological terms that doesn't advert to these mental states. Okay, so just to finish up then, what is the best alternative on offer? I would say it is functional role semantics. Semantics in quotation marks there, because our traditional notion of semantics, of course, is the meanings of the symbols, the meanings of the words, how words mean things. And here, semantics and meaning could be in Dr. Evil quotes too, meaning is use. That was Wittgenstein's big slogan, that if you want to know what the meaning of something is, the meaning of something is the way that it's being used. So think of a word like a tool, or think of a concept like a tool. On this view, there isn't much of a difference between words and concepts. If you think of concepts as things that hold steady while words are fluxing, there's kind of only the flux, I think. So then this comes from Ludwig Wittgenstein. He developed this in the book Philosophical Investigations, and we call this functional role semantics. So think about what it is that you're doing. You're communicating, you're making, let's break it down. You're making noises, you're moving these muscles, let's be silly about it. You're moving these muscles in your larynx, and you're making sound compression, air compression waves. And they're vibrating the tympanic membranes and the ears of other people. Mostly that's what you're doing, vibrating the tympanic membranes and the ears of other people. But you're doing it because you want this or that to happen in the world. You have projects, you're doing things, and you're trying to move through, and that's what you're doing. So what has evolved here over a very long period of time is this communication system. It doesn't have any set meaning anymore. It changes over time. It's got a lot of structure, but come back 100 years later, it's still got just as much structure, but everything has changed into something different. Language doesn't sit still like that. That's a really basic problem with the classical conception of meaning. It says, well, there is a meaning, that's the meaning that's assigned. When did it get the meaning? When was the baptism of the meaning? Well, that's an interesting border case by Kripke, who understands this problem very, very well. All right. So what is functional role semantics? I don't want to just throw out other words. You say there's a really long history, a really big set of human actions when they made those noises. And they were all trying to do this kind of thing when they made those noises. With all these varieties, if you looked at two extremes, you wouldn't recognize. So that set of actions, that set of intentionally driven actions that you're trying to do by making those noises, let's keep saying, that's what you mean by meaning. Just as with justice, remember famously Wittgenstein criticized Plato by saying Plato never even considered a single actual example in the real world. Justice here would be, for the nominalist, nom from nombre, nom, the name of a set of physical particular things. In this case, the set of state of affairs, actions, and other things that we would call just. Okay, and they all have something in common. That's a problem for nominalism. They want to talk about sort of primitive similarities at that end of things. Again, notice we're talking about metaphysics here, because what's the nominalist doing? When the nominalist says, well, what we're really doing with abstract concepts, abstract nouns are really just names of sets of concrete particular things. And that's materialism, right? So even if you didn't quite follow the baseball all the way around, notice that the nominalist is a kind of empiricist and materialist who's trying to show how they can interpret the meanings of abstract language in concrete terms. And that's metaphysical. All right, that's what metaphysics is. I think this might be the last slide. Just notice in passing that people think of skepticism as one of these things that never changes, and we can talk about skepticism for 2,000 years and all that sort of thing, but actually not really. If you think that what you experience is a mental representation of the world and you don't have some sort of direct experience, whatever that means, then a skeptical question mark emerges. Descartes really gave us a very healthy strand of skepticism that might not have taken root the way it did without him. There was also skepticism coming to us from the classical period, but not everyone in that period is skeptical either. And I actually do think that empiricist approaches over the last 200 years have made real progress in terms of dealing with Cartesian skepticism in a way that I find, really fairly satisfying. But of course, that's a matter of a lot of different things. Philosophy is very personal. Philosophy is part of the humanities. So notice then, just to get this over with, if you think that what you're experiencing is a representation of the world, then that's when automatically, by definition, what comes baked into that is a big question mark as to the relationship between your mental representation of the world and the actual world. So if you didn't have that theory of mind, of representational theory of mind, then it looks like that skeptical question would not arise. Okay, is that the last one? Yeah, that's the last one. Okay, so let me step out. Stop the share. So yeah, this is actually kind of a big one. Intentionality. I hope that if you're interested in philosophy and you've heard intentionality before and you weren't quite sure what that word meant, I hope maybe this helped out a little bit. And then If you followed, along well enough, I think you also now understand, hopefully, maybe a little bit more about what metaphysics is and why it still might make sense to talk about metaphysics or to speak in metaphysical terms. And then finally taking the lens even out further, you see that what philosophers do is sort of look at concepts and do semantics, right? Really think about, well, what is the meaning of this concept? I think that's when I look at what's really going on, I guess that's what I think is what's really going on. Anyway, so now intend to stop. Thank you very much, and lots of good stuff to read about this one.